Yep. Well, it is 4:01, and who am I to go a little bit too late? So I just want to welcome everybody. I'm Paige Sharp. I'm the Deputy Director of Programs with the Indiana Arts Commission. I'm very excited that you guys are here. I know that the Arts, Cultural, and Destination Marketing Organization support program has been a valuable resource for you all. And then reporting is going to be coming along. So thrilled to have Elaine Luttrell here. She just does such a great job, I think, explaining complex information in a really accessible way. It has a long history of being able to do that. So we'd love to bring her to the table to help share information in a way that's easy to understand. And I am happy to introduce Elaine, who can give you a little bit of background for herself.
That sounds so wonderful. Thanks, Paige. Welcome, everyone. Huge thanks to Joshua and Paige and the entire staff of the Indiana Arts Commission, who have been doing some tremendous heavy lifting in supporting organizations as we're all going through this time, including hosting conversations like these. As Paige mentioned, my name is Elaine. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a mid-career white female with medium length, although it's longer length now, wavy blonde hair, and I'm wearing a brownish tweed jacket, a black top, and a piece of jewelry, a necklace, by an amazing designer out of Austin, Texas, named Jenny Guild. It is lovely to be with you today. I am a CPA by training and a personal financial specialist, and I have an accredited financial counselor designation, all of which is to say there are a lot of letters there that mean I talk about money in the arts, and I have the very great privilege of working with creative organizations and funders and individuals all over the country to have these conversations. And this year, we have been having a lot of them because, as you all know, it is a challenging time to be running an arts organization and navigating some of the financial challenges that have come with the pandemic and also have come with all the different support programs that have emerged in part as a result of the pandemic. So I'm thrilled you are all here. We do want to make sure everyone is making liberal use of the chat. This is a great opportunity to ask some questions you might have, especially when it comes to that final report that you'll begin to prepare if you haven't already started. And the IAC team is here and ready. We are all keeping an eye on the chat. So definitely put your questions there, especially as we're going through this, because we want to have room for lots of voices. There are a number of us here on the call, so go ahead and keep yourself muted if you're not speaking, so we can minimize any background noise, and then we'll go from there. So we have about an hour together, and we thought we would spend the time reviewing the final grant report application together, just to address a couple of common questions that the team has started hearing. And we wanted to make you aware of what we would think of as some best practices, especially as you're navigating documentation for the expenses that are eligible for this particular program. And of course, we want to make sure to answer questions as well as we can. And I say as well as we can because some of the answers are still a little fuzzy. We are waiting for clarification on a couple of things. And as new questions come up, if the team doesn't know the answer, we seek out the answer. But that means it's not always very clear and easy to answer all of the questions. So keep them coming and we will do the best we can. In terms of things to do, I want you to start by just taking a deep breath. It is a stressful time. Under normal circumstances, you are juggling year-end contributions, you are juggling holiday programming, you are navigating mid-year fiscal year reporting, perhaps if you're on a June 30 fiscal year. And this year, there's a whole lot of uncertainty wrapped up with so many of those things. Your programs may have migrated online, they may have been paused, they might be bringing in fewer contributions than normal. And you are also navigating these new grant programs and perhaps PPP forgiveness and watching legislation to see if there might be more aid on the horizon for organizations like yours. There's a lot going on. So just take a breath, relax, Remember that we are all in this together and it is going to be okay, but you are not expected to have all of the answers. And I hope you don't expect us to have all of the answers either, but everyone is doing their best. So we'll just go ahead and assume good intentions from everyone working in this space. Step 2, after you've started exhaling and you've taken a deep breath, go ahead and get started on your report. The final grant report is not due until February 10th, but you are going to need plenty of time to prepare this report. So take that deep breath and then go ahead and get started, because the sooner you can get started, the sooner you can address any questions you might have, and the sooner you can share those questions with the team at the IAC. So couple dates I want to draw your attention to. You already heard me mention one, February 10th. I'm going to come back to that one. But the first date that's on the horizon is December 30th. This is the end of the covered period for this grant, which means any services you are paying for with the grant or any goods you are paying for with the grant need to be received by December 30th. The funds also must be expended by December 30th. I keep saying June. I think mentally I am in summer, but we are absolutely in December right now. Everything must be expended by December 30th, and the services rendered and the goods have to be received by December 30th. So for example, let's pretend you have you want to do some marketing for a show in the spring, and you want the marketing to include COVID specific language, which feels like it could apply under this program, but prepaying for that marketing is not eligible for this grant, right? Because that's associated with a program for 2021. And even if it's in the same fiscal year for you, that's not an eligible expense for purposes of this grant. Similarly, let's pretend right now you're ordering some cleaning supplies, maybe additional PPE, and you order those things, maybe you even receive them, but if you do not pay the invoice until January, that also doesn't count because the funds have to be expended by December 30th. So definitely keep that date in mind. It is the official end of the covered period. Now, my gut tells me many of you may have already expended all of the grant dollars you were eligible for. So it is my hope that this date is not going to surprise you or cause issues for you, but definitely keep it in mind. The next date that you need to have in your brain is February 10th. Your final report is due on February 10th. It's a Wednesday at 4:30 Eastern time. So those organizations in the western part of the state, make sure you are aware that this is an Eastern time deadline, not Central time, and mark your calendars accordingly. I will share the team has 479 grantees that they are supporting. So that's 479 final reports that are due on February 10th. So if you have questions, if you need support from the team, definitely try to get that support long in advance of February 10th, because as we know, these deadlines can sometimes sneak up on us, and it's going to be very hard to get your question answered quickly if it is February 8th or 9th or the 10th. I will also note that there are general guidelines around the submission of late reports. So if your report is submitted late, the award would be reduced by a certain percentage per day, or it could be rescinded completely. But you don't need to worry about that because you are starting your final report right now while we are in the midst of pandemic spending, and you are going to get your report finished and submitted long before the deadline, so you do not have to worry about any of these penalties. We all know there are not dollars to spare right now. So definitely get your report in on time so you don't even have to worry about those late report penalties. I also want to draw your attention to the time frame of 5 years. This is the amount of time you need to keep documentation about funds expended under this program. So what does that mean, and when does the 5-year clock start? The 5-year clock starts when you get your final payment, so your final reimbursement from this grant. and it starts then, and then it goes for 5 years. So if you had expenses incurred, say in April of 2020, that were reimbursed under this grant, but you did not get the final payment from the grant until, say, February of 2021, your 5-year clock starts February of 2021, and then it goes 5 years from then. Larger organizations, if you have a document retention policy that is different than 5 years, you're going to want to make sure that you're not accidentally getting rid of documentation sooner than the 5-year period that you need to retain it for under this particular program. Some organizations might have, say, a 3-year document retention policy. That is perfectly fine, but definitely know that there are some things that are not eligible for that policy because you need to save everything associated with this grant for 5 years. So make sure you are making note of that. For smaller organizations, in case you do not have a formal document retention policy, just make sure you are noting these requirements and acting accordingly. So let's talk documentation. I want you to channel your inner accountant here as you are thinking about this process, because the more organized you can be, the easier this is going to be. And I want to sort of mentally prepare you. This is not going to be the most fulfilling thing you will do this year. This is an administrative task that is very detail oriented, and it requires a lot of sort of nuanced steps. So be prepared for that and know that you are doing it, even if it's not your favorite thing, in service of something very important. So when we're thinking about this documentation, there are kind of 2 big questions we want the documentation to answer. Number 1, what did you spend? And number 2, how was it eligible? So let's go a little bit deeper into each of those. For the what did you spend question, we want to see some sort of receipt. And I'm saying we, but I'm using that as a global term. And you want to make sure that the receipt is showing the amount you spent and some sort of description of what you spent it on, right? It can be a receipt if you purchased cleaning supplies or PPE. It can be an invoice if you hired a musician, for example, as a contractor. It could be a bill, say a utility bill that you might have used under operational costs. It can be a contract. It might be a payroll report if you are getting reimbursed for salaries under part of this program. If you are including marketing materials, definitely include the marketing expense. Maybe it is printing costs, or maybe it is an invoice from a marketing firm for some sort of digital design fee, but then also include a copy of the marketing materials, right? So there's a little bit of extra nuance, and what we need in these different categories definitely depends on the category. So as you are going through and filling out this final report or getting all the pieces together, keep those guidelines handy. They are linked all over the portal and the website with lots of information, and there is such good stuff in there. Keep those guidelines handy so that you can make sure you are keeping the right documentation for each category. So you need some sort of receipt, some sort of external proof that the expense happened that shows the amount and a description of it. But you might need to add to the description. And personally, I would suggest that you do add to the description. The purpose may not be obvious, even if it is super obvious to you because you are deeply embedded in this process of making your organization survive right now. An outsider might not have that same context and might not clearly understand the purpose or the description on the receipt that seems really obvious to you. So make it super, super obvious. You can write it on the receipt. You can document it in the system. If you are pulling together documentation in digital form, you can add text to those digital files. And I would suggest that as you are describing these expenses, borrow the language that you see in the grant from how we describe eligible expenses. I have some of it here. So one eligible expense is a fee for an artist, right? and hopefully, or perhaps some of your funds are going to fees for artists. The exact language from the grant says fees for artists and or contractual personnel that are critical to the project or the organization's operations and services. That's the kind of language you can borrow to add to the receipt. So you are making it really obvious that there is a direct line between what's eligible and the amount that you spent. So definitely make it as clear and as obvious as possible and use the language that already exists. Also, we want to make sure what we're spending is going in the right categories. The categories established by the grant are shown here in this key point box. They are salary support, artists or contractual services, facility operational costs, canceled event production costs, transitioning services, and marketing. So these are the existing categories that your expenses can fit within, and they are all described in more detail in the guidelines. I want to draw your attention as well to the fact that these might be different categories than what you would use on your profit and loss statement or your statement of activities. That's okay. What we need, though, is for the expenses to go in the category that matches the grant. So as you are pulling all of your documentation together, I would go ahead and note on the receipt or on the backup or on the support what category that expense is going into, because that's going to make it easier to kind of build up the evidence that there is a receipt and it is eligible and it goes in this category so that you can match it with your final report, which will show some details and also some total information. You'll probably note as well, towards the bottom of these slides, we have the guidelines linked. You are probably very familiar with the resources that exist for this grant, but we wanted to make sure the information was there so that you could draw upon it if you needed to. So let's talk a little bit more about those categories. And I'm noting in the chat some great discussion. Joshua from the IAC is responding to questions, specifically one from Benjamin. So thanks for doing that, and keep those questions coming so that we can make sure all the information is answered for you. So
can I just jump in real quick?
Yes, please, Bridget.
So for our folks on YouTube, if you could repeat any questions that you see in the chat here on Zoom, and then what the answers are, I think that would be helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bridget, for that reminder. Benjamin had a question in the chat that says, if we need to obtain a piece of technology to facilitate a rehearsal period in December 2020 for a COVID adapted performance opening in January, can this be eligible? And Josh replied, hey, Benjamin, great question. Yes, since the rehearsal period is in December of 2020, it would be eligible. It is part of that covered period. And Josh notes as well that he's happy to talk more about the specifics in the Q&A or afterwards. Again, the team has been incredibly responsive at IAC, so keep those questions coming and we'll make sure to call them out verbally and also address anything else that might come up in the Q&A. So let's talk more about those categories. There are a couple of things to draw your attention to within these categories. The first category, and it might be where many of your expenses are going depending on your organization, is salary support. What's noteworthy here is that as of this moment in time, payroll taxes are not an eligible expense for salary support. We are only looking at the dollars that ultimately make it to the employee, not any payroll taxes associated with those dollars. And so this is a little bit of a mental hurdle, because sometimes when we think about what we're paying someone or salary support, we forget that some is being withheld for payroll taxes. So at this moment in time, we exclude payroll taxes from any amounts in the salary support line. I will note, though, this may change. This is one of those open questions that we are waiting for additional guidance and clarification on. So it is very possible that you will see an alert from the Indiana Arts Commission providing additional information about that. And I understand that you might be really frustrated to get that information, but This is an ongoing changing process, and a lot of the rules are being written and clarified in real time. So as of this moment in time, exclude payroll taxes from this category, but do know that this may change. When it comes to facility operational costs, all cleaning during the covered period, again, that's March through December 30th, is eligible here, even if it is not COVID specific cleaning. And I think that's an important point. So make sure you're processing that as well. When it comes to canceled event production costs, make sure that the cost you have incurred is not refundable. Otherwise, it's not really a cost to you. And make sure also you cannot carry it over. For example, if you paid a deposit for a performance or for an event, and that deposit is going to be applied to the rescheduled version of the event in 2021, that wouldn't qualify, right? Because that's not really a cost that you had. It is something that essentially is going to be applied to the future period. And in this category, you might have to provide documentation about the fact that whatever costs you incurred are non-refundable or non-carry-overable, if that's a word. So definitely make sure you are clear on what's eligible in this category, and make sure that if you are putting an expense here, it really is something that you incurred and fully lost, as opposed to something that was refunded or something you can carry forward to a future year. And then when it comes to that marketing category, definitely include a copy of the marketing collateral as well. So in addition to showing the receipt or the invoice or the printing costs or the shipping costs of the marketing materials, you want to also make sure you're including a copy of what that material looked like. The next thing to think about is, how was that expense eligible? And there are a couple of things to think about here. We already know the categories and we know the descriptions, and we're borrowing some of the language, which is fantastic. But I want to make sure the expense took place during that covered period. So that is between March 1st and December 30th of 2020, right? So the expense had to take place during that time period for it to be eligible. And services must be rendered or goods must be received before December 30th as well. And the expense has to be paid. I know it seems like we're harping on this a lot, but definitely make sure you are clear that the expense has to be within this covered period, March 1st through December 30th, in order for it to be eligible. There's a question from YouTube. The question says, to clarify, we are only allowed to use the cost of the salary's post-tax amount, or just not claiming the payroll taxes which the organization pays as liabilities? That is a fantastic question for clarification. As of right now, it is only the cost of the salaries post-tax. So let's pretend, super simple example, you pay someone, a W-2 employee, $100, but of course you withhold, say, $20, and then they receive $80. Then the organization would also kick in another, say, $8 to match the Social Security and Medicare withholdings, right? The amount that you could claim for purposes of this grant at this moment in time is $80, because that is the post-tax employee amount. So great clarification question from YouTube. Thank you very much for that. There's another question in the chat from Tatiana. Tatiana says, under which category should we put IT as website services, etc.? And Joshua clarifies in the chat, they can be classified either as facility operational costs for general IT costs, or for transitioning services if it was a specific IT cost related to COVID. So that's an example where the description is going to be important to help clarify whether a cost for IT is facility operational cost, or if it is transitional, for example, a cost to move a program online or something like that. Josh continues in the chat, for example, if it's the annual website fee facility operational costs makes the most sense. If you paid for a Zoom account or another online platform because of COVID, it might make sense to put that under transitioning services. So again, your receipt would be the same in either case. It would be the invoice or the receipt from the web service or the invoice from Zoom. And in your description, you would go into more detail about what it was and then what category made the most sense for that. When it comes to eligible expenses, we want to make sure that whatever you are including is eligible, but it's also not ineligible. And that's sort of a confusing way to say that, but you'll recall there is a list of ineligible expenses as part of the guidelines. Some things are very specifically called out. So make sure what you are including is not ineligible. So for example, a couple caught my attention. If it's a new program and service not directly related to the impact of COVID, that is ineligible. So make sure as you're going through this, you are very clear about not simply launching a new program, but launching a new program directly related to the impact of COVID for it to be eligible, right? So as we think about taking a program and moving it online, if it was an existing program that was then adapted to online because of COVID, that feels like it could make sense as a transitional expense, right? Or transitioning services. But if it's a brand new program you're creating, then it probably doesn't make sense. It might fall into one of these not eligible categories. So make sure you're spending the time to go through and again, make the case that what you're doing is eligible and it is not one of these ineligible expenses. The other thing that is ineligible is additions to cash reserves. That one caught my attention because we know organizations are hurting right now, and we know that being able to have some dollars to provide a bit of a cushion, especially as we continue planning into 2021 and beyond, having some cash brings a lot of comfort because times are really tight right now, but cash reserves are ineligible when it comes to this grant. These dollars must be expended. They cannot be held in reserve. So make sure you're paying attention to those things as you're going through this process, and spend the time to double check the date and double check that list of ineligible expenses before you submit your final report. I also want to make sure we're very clear that even if something is eligible, if it has been funded from a different program, it is not eligible for this grant. So for example, perhaps you're an organization that received PPP funding, and as part of your PPP loan that may have been forgiven by now, you may have used some of those dollars to fund utility payments or rent for your space, right? Which was perfectly eligible under the guidelines of the PPP program. You cannot also use that utility bill as a reimbursable expense under this program. If something was already paid under a different program, it is ineligible for this program. And when we think about it and step back, that makes perfect sense, right? You can't apply the same expense to two different funding sources. But things are moving quickly and the records are not always kept as pristine as we would hope they would be in a normal year. And things were moving really fast. And a lot of these programs had guidelines that were coming out in very real time. So give yourself permission right now to go through some of your details, maybe clean up those records and double check to make sure you are not counting expenses toward two different programs. The process I would go through, and admittedly, I come from an accounting background, so this is a process rooted in detail and organization, and that doesn't always work in the arts, but to the extent that you can channel your inner accountant, this would be the time to do that. I would start with your general ledger detail report. So if you use QuickBooks or another general ledger system, you can print out or digitize a detailed report that shows every transaction. For you larger organizations, this might make your head spin. So if you don't want to do the whole detailed report, that's okay. Maybe run a detailed report for the different general ledger accounts that might have expenses that would qualify for this program. For smaller organizations, you can run the whole thing and then go through it and identify the eligible expenses that you are going to fund with this program. If it were me, I would probably highlight it on paper, but you can figure out the process that works best for you. After you've identified them, identify which grant category makes sense, and then write the description next to each expense, borrowing that language and adding that clarification, like Josh shared in the chat about distinguishing whether something is a transitioning service or if it's a facility operational cost. And I would go ahead and add that to your general ledger. And again, this almost feels like a working paper that you're putting together, but it's something you're going to save so that if you need to answer questions later, all the information is there. After you've done that, then you need to go to your bookkeeper or your accounts payable clerk or your accountant or anyone within the organization that has the detail behind all of those expenses. This would be the invoice or the receipt or the contract, any documentation that the accounting team or the accounts payable clerk or the bookkeeper has to support that expense, they will be able to pull for you. And I would ask them to make a copy of it so that you have it with your general ledger report that has identified all the eligible information. If you are the bookkeeper and the head of the organization and the programming director, this might be a lot of hours for you as you trade hats and go through this process, but that's okay. If your bookkeeper is on your board, maybe the treasurer or a volunteer position, bring them into this process as well so that you have at least two people helping to build up all the documentation you need. As I mentioned, on the backup, so the receipt or the contract or the invoice or whatever you have to support the expense in your general ledger, you will see an amount, probably a description. Maybe you add information to that as well that explains the purpose and the eligibility. More is better than less in this particular situation. And then after you've gone through that process, back up. Double check the dates, make sure they're within the covered period, make sure that everything is eligible, and scan through that list of ineligible expenses to make sure that you are not accidentally including something that is ineligible. And what's really happening here is we're basically creating a packet of documentation that has all the supporting documentation, the summary reports, and you can trace the path from the receipt up through the eventual category it's funded from through this grant so that you have that nice packet of information. And maybe you store it digitally, maybe it exists in a file folder that gets filed away with other grant reports you have, but it's there so that if you fill in the information online through the final report portal and then there are some questions later, you don't have to rebuild this documentation. It's there, you trace through everything, and you've got everything you need. This is an example of the template the Indiana Arts Commission put together to kind of help with this process of rolling up the detail into summaries. So feel free to use this as a starting point if you would like, or if it is helpful. If you would not like, and if it is not helpful, that's okay. This is just a tool that is meant to help. If you're really comfortable with Excel or Google Sheets, you might love this as a resource. If you're not, you might go the paper route, and that is perfectly fine. I might suggest, if you are going that paper route, to create a sort of title page or lead sheet, if you will, to the packet that shows you the summary information and the detail line by line. What's interesting to me about this particular type of lead sheet, we would call an accounting world, or some sort of title page or summary sheet, is that it's got the categories, and these will match what you are submitting with your final report. And it has these total amounts for each category. So again, this will match what you are submitting, but it also shows you the detail, not in a stack of receipts, but in a nice organized list that you can scan through quickly. So again, what we're wanting to make sure is as you are giving yourself time to pull all of this information together, you're making sure that you're not just uploading totals and you're saving the calculations that went into all of those totals so that you can answer questions later if they come up. Question in the chat from Mary. Will the Indiana Arts Commission be sending out a link to all participants with the recorded final report grant meeting? And the answer is yes, absolutely. You will get a copy of the recording for anyone who has registered. So make sure to watch for that if you are going through this information again. So there were a couple of questions that came in advance, and one of them might apply to you. What if my expenses are different than what I originally requested? So perhaps you are, or you originally implied assuming that all of your expenses would be in the salary support category, but now you have realized because of other funding or because of other circumstances, that's no longer the case. That is totally fine. There is a question about that in the report how the award was spent section of the final report. So you can include details and clear documentation, and that is perfectly fine. Another question that might apply to you, what if your backup, so the receipt and or the contract, whatever documentation you have, what if it shows a higher amount than you can be reimbursed for? And the answer is you want to list in the final report the maximum reimbursement amount as the actual expense. And I would make a note on the backup that there is a difference because you reached your maximum reimbursement amount. So think about a simple example. Let's say you applied for a $4,800 grant and you were going to use it for facility operational costs. And then as you're gathering all of your receipts together, you realized during the covered period, you actually spent $4,900 and you've got the receipts that show that you spent $4,900. You are still only eligible for $4,800 because that's the grant you received. So report expenses of $4,800 and then include the backup of $4,900 if you need to do that, and just note on the receipts or in the final report that there is a difference. But $4,800, the maximum amount you were granted, is going to be your actual expense. As I mentioned, if you are running an organization and you are wearing lots of different hats, you would basically go through the same process, only you might not have a bookkeeper to ask for backup. So you would be going to your own receipts, maybe the treasurer of your organization or someone else to help. But again, the process is going to be the same. And for smaller arts organizations where executive directors and artistic directors are pulled in a number of different directions, I would argue it's actually more important that you be fully prepared to answer questions about this and to be as organized as possible so that when you're answering questions, it's not actually detracting you from the very important work you should be doing. I will put a small plug in for this general process for all of your grants. I know it is a lot of work, and I know occasionally there is tension between development departments who do most of the grant reporting and then the accounting departments that provide support to the development or fundraising departments. But creating these packets of information and knowing where you're pulling the information from can be really helpful, especially if you are providing similar grant reports to the same funders year after year. You're really streamlining the process and making it easy for you to repeat that process over time. I will pause here. There have been a couple of different questions I'd love to share. Susan asked in the chat, will people be getting a copy of the lovely spreadsheet example? And it is in fact a lovely spreadsheet example. Joshua confirms, yes, absolutely. They will provide a link to the spreadsheet in the follow-up email. And it is in the final grant report. And if you navigate to the IAC's website where the information for this this grant is housed. There are a lot of different resources under each of those tabs that you can navigate to. So spend some time poking around on that website, because it really includes a wealth of resources. Dwayne asks, is a lease agreement sufficient, or do we need to submit canceled check images to show proof of payment? That's a great question, Dwayne. And Josh says, for rent payment, a copy of the lease agreement is sufficient for documentation. Then he goes on, if we have any questions or concerns, we'll reach out for canceled check images as well. And that being said, if you want to go ahead and include them from the beginning, it might be helpful to have additional extra documentation. But to reconfirm, Josh says for rent payments, a copy of the lease agreement is sufficient. We have some additional time here for questions. I have the resources, a couple that you may find useful, listed here. And again, these are going to be shared out via email with all of the registered participants. So definitely make sure to bookmark those and think about them. I'll leave them on the screen as we address any additional resources. And Josh, as we're walking through some of these questions, I would love to have you unmute and jump in on some of these as well. Mary asks in the chat, can I briefly walk through the overview of eligible payroll post taxes? So this would be the net amount that would be eligible, correct? And Mary, you are absolutely correct. So if we're thinking about gross payments, right? And then you have tax withholdings, it is the net amount that is eligible for the salary category there. And again, stay tuned just in case there's additional guidance, but as of today, use the net amount. Anne asks, will we ultimately be uploading a completed spreadsheet as well as a big PDF of receipts? And Josh, I'm going to punt this question to you. Apologies if you are furiously typing the answer in the chat. Are you able to answer Anne's question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Anne. So you will be uploading a spreadsheet and a PDF of receipts. In the final grant report, you'll see that it's actually broken up by section. So first, you'll get to upload your spreadsheet at the top, and then within each expense category, so for example, for salary support, you'll have one PDF. For facility operational costs, you'll have another PDF, and so on. So they'll be in different sections there. And actually, before we jump to the next question, I want to circle back to Ron's question, he asked earlier in the chat about if they contracted with an artist and sent them the check. The check is dated before December 30th, but does the artist need to cash that check before December 30th so that it's actually expended this year? What do you think, Elaine?
I think that is a fantastic question. In a perfect world, the artist would cash the check so it clears your bank account and then there are no questions. I would very much like you to encourage them to do that just because it will make it easier. Additionally, if you are able to transfer funds bank account to bank account, that could be a good way to do it as well. So you're not relying on them to deposit the check. However, it might also depend on your accounting approach. So if you are an organization that uses the accrual basis of accounting, you might be closer to okay on this, but perfect world, best case scenario, the dollars have fully left your account. So I would very much encourage your artists to deposit those checks quickly. Deep down, knowing a whole lot of artists, I imagine they are as anxious to deposit the checks as you are to cut them. So hopefully this wouldn't be a huge issue, but I think also this is an area where some communication could be really helpful. So if you give them a heads up that this was, payment to them was funded through a particular program that needs to have expenses processed by December 30th. Hopefully they would be willing to help you out there. So Josh, thanks for calling out that question. I missed it in the scroll. And thank you, Ron, for asking that question. It's a great one. There's a question from Jeff who says, in our grant agreement, it lists Exhibit C, annual financial report for non-governmental entities. Josh, is this something you can explain?
That's a great question. I'm not exactly sure what that's referring to, but Jeff, I'm happy to follow up offline. I can send you an email after this and take a look at your grant agreement specifically to see what's going on.
Perfect. Mary has a question as well. If we give art teacher gift certificates for their help in helping with the COVID different venue outdoors and supplying art, is that a covered cost? That's also an interesting question. And in thinking about the different categories, it might sort of hinge on what category it makes sense in. If those supplies were perhaps part of a contract you had with the artist, that could be part of the artist's contractual service cost. It could also be part of transitioning services if you're thinking about it as a cost to modify operations for outdoors. Joshua, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. In general, gifts would not be eligible expenses or any re-granting of the expenses to another entity. So I would err on the side of no, that would not be eligible. Yeah, if there's more concern, I'm happy to follow up offline, but in general, gifts wouldn't be eligible.
Does it matter if it's more like an honorarium or acknowledgement payment for services as opposed to a gift in the traditional sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if it is, if it's more of like that artist or contractual personnel category where it's related to like a certain engagement or a certain event, maybe, I guess is the short answer, but I need to take a closer look at it to see.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And highlighting again your point about erring on the side of caution, right? So, if it feels like you're maybe stretching, then I think probably let's not stretch. Let's go to Barbara's question. Barbara says, if you use online bill pay and have copies of the checks or proof of payment initiation via the bank website, will that count? Josh, feel free to overrule me, but I think that is great documentation to have, but there should also be another underlying piece that shows why you made the bill pay. So proof that the dollars went out, I think is fantastic, but then also having that additional backup that would have the bill or the invoice or whatever prompted that payment is probably a good strategy. What do you think, Joshua?
Yeah, I totally agree. Sort of those bill pay or bank statements are really a great secondary sort of piece of documentation, like you mentioned, but definitely need to see that what's the receipt or the invoice that it's actually showing why that payment happened and what it was for, and more of those details.
Yeah, I think that's great. If we were just to kind of step back and think about this, right? It's yes, the expense happened. And also, why did the expense happen, right? So it's that why. And, for a smaller organization that might be less formally run, your contract with the artist or some of your, contractual obligations might be emails, right? And, obviously we would love it to be slightly more official than that, but at least that could be prompting the why behind why you made the payment and documenting sort of that. So make sure you're answering the why and then the payment piece as well. And Barbara clarifies she did just mean for the proof of payment. So that's great. Thank you. Kay has a question. Kay says, since all funds were indicated as being used for mortgage, is it appropriate to pull a report indicating payments from our lender? Although Kay clarifies later that they meant payments to the lender as documentation. I would say yes, I believe so. Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, that seems appropriate to me.
Perfect. I'm scanning through. The questions have slowed slightly, but maybe that's just because you're pulling together all of your documentation and unable to type your question right now. I'll also give it another moment for our friends on YouTube to see if additional questions are coming up there. Sometimes it takes a moment to have them added to the chat here on Zoom. But if you have questions, definitely plop them in the chat through whatever platform you're using. I think if we were to kind of summarize, still take that deep breath, right? Especially now that we have spent nearly an hour thinking about all of this. So take the deep breath, definitely give yourself plenty of time, which probably means starting on the final grant report now, if you haven't already. Again, for many organizations, because the covered period stretched from March through December, you may have already expended the funds, which means you can start pulling together all that documentation and getting the numbers and essentially the packet of information ready to go to be submitted. So that way, you know, you can run it by Josh or the team at IAC, you can clear up any questions, you can pay attention to any additional guidance that might come out, right? And then you can be ready to go well in advance of that February 10th deadline at 4:30 Eastern time. As we're thinking about this, we need the documentation of the why of the expense. So that's that underlying receipt. And it could be an invoice, a bill, a contract, all sorts of different things that explain the why of the expense. We want to make sure the expense was in fact within that covered period from March 1st through December 30th of 2020. And we want to make sure the cash goes out within that covered period as well. So to Roy's question about writing the check and waiting for the artist to possibly deposit it after December 30th, nudging them and encouraging them to deposit it right away is a really good communication strategy. We also want to double check to make sure the descriptions on that documentation are tight and they are borrowing language from the grant and they are clearly explaining how the expense is eligible based on the grant's guidelines. Your final scan through all of that documentation is going to be to look for any ineligible expenses that you may have accidentally included, especially when it comes to reporting some of these same expenses for different sources of funding. We really want to make sure that is not happening. So as you pull all that stuff together and make it neat and organized to the extent possible, then you can go ahead and enter the information and upload the documentation in the appropriate categories on the final grant report, and then exhale again because you're finished. I'm scanning through the chat again. Josh, what have I missed in terms of questions here?
I think you've actually covered everything. One point I also wanted to emphasize is about marketing. And this doesn't apply to too many folks, really just the people that are using marketing as one of those eligible categories. But just a reminder that marketing is a really specific and has a narrow definition for the purposes of this grant, that the marketing really needs to be focused on COVID safe reopening. So not just advertising an event or not advertising, we're moving online, but really, we're doing this event, it's outdoors, here's how we're staying COVID safe, and we'd love you to come and attend. So just keep that in mind. And again, including those marketing materials is going to allow us to assess that and make sure that it's eligible.
Absolutely. I got a private message from, this is an anonymous question. Can an email serve as contractual documentation? So for example, let's say a program coordinator hires an artist and agrees to pay the artist a stipend for a service, and that is documented via email. So the program coordinator sends an email to the artist that says, we're so glad you'll be participating in this very special COVID specific program, and we agree to pay you $500 in exchange for your virtual performance using our platform or something like that. My gut says yes, that would qualify as documentation of the contractual obligation. And then of course, we would want to see the transfer happening to the artist in an amount that matches that to make sure that all the pieces are pulled together. Josh, is that your gut as well?
Yeah, that makes sense. And if there's any questions about it, or if there's something that's, not immediately clear from that email exchange, that's when we would just follow up and ask for maybe additional documentation, or, if you can input it on letterhead and get a signature from you and the artist that this is what the contractual agreement was. In a couple of instances, we've had that type of follow-up needed, but yeah, in general, having that email exchange should be okay. But again, a lot of these things are case-by-case basis. So if there's any question, one, I'd say add extra documentation. It's always good to make it extra clear where the money went and when it went out. But two, we can always follow up if we have questions.
That's great. Diane has a question in the chat as well. Diane says, if we're not sure if something is an eligible expense, but we know we spent more than the full grant amount in a different category or two, is that a problem if we can document the full grant amount? And Diane, I would say no, that's probably not a problem. However, be very, very careful about including an ineligible expense. So this is where, as you're pulling together all of your eligible expenses and you know they come out to more than the full grant amount, you're probably okay. But definitely read through and scrutinize carefully, because if you accidentally include something that is ineligible, the report may be rejected or it may come back with additional questions simply because something you included was ineligible. So I would say scrutinize it extra carefully for those ineligible expenses, but it's probably not a problem if everything is eligible and the full amount was expended across multiple categories. Josh, you're nodding, so that makes me feel good that you agree.
Yeah, no, definitely agree. And I was thinking it might be helpful to add a little more context as we're wrapping up. What happens after someone submits their final grant report? So I'm happy to walk through that briefly. So you submit your final grant report. It goes into a queue for the IAC to review. We have a team of about 6 to 8 folks that are working on the ACDMO grant. So one of us will go in, we'll read through your report, we'll download the Excel spreadsheet and the different documentation. We'll check to make sure that the numbers add up, as well as the documentation is clear, and we check it off for each item. And then we make sure that the grant, of course, is fully filled out. We have all the information we need. And if it's good to go, then it's marked as complete, and you'll get an email, sometimes usually a couple of days or a few days after that, letting you know it's been complete, it's been accepted, and just a reminder, hey, don't forget to save your records for that 5-year period. On the other hand, if we do have any questions, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll make a note of that in the report, and then we'll send you an email directly saying, hey, reviewed the report, it looks great, but for salary expenses, we need a little more clarification on, where the payroll expenses were and, how much these people were paid for these periods. And then a lot of times what we'll do is actually move it back into a draft status. So it might look to you like, oh, I thought I submitted it. We'll push it back so that you can edit it again and then resubmit and include that additional information. And then we'll be able to review it again and mark it complete, hopefully.
Awesome. And remember, everybody's on the same team here, right? So getting that email for extra clarification, right? That's not a bad thing. That is just hey, I need to add some more information, and that is okay. We have one more question from Bill that I think is a really good one. Bill says, does the canceled event category count truly a full cancellation, or can it include a severe reduction in attendance due to COVID? Which I think is a great question. If we're talking about lost revenue, right? So normally your event would earn $100,000 or bring in $100,000, but this year it only brought in $2,000. You might think of $98,000 as sort of lost revenue from a canceled event. That is not an expense that is reimbursable under this grant. That is unfortunate that the revenue was so much lower than normal, but that's not something that would be an eligible expense. But as you're thinking about costs you had associated with an event that was canceled, if you had a security deposit that was not refunded, if you had paid for an insurance policy that was not refunded, if you had prepaid artists for something that was not refunded, those are the types of event expenses for a canceled event that could be eligible in that category. Josh, any final closing words of wisdom for the group?
Yes, just a big thank you to everyone who attended and for all of your questions and all of your thoughtful questions, and for submitting your final grant reports early. I know you're all going to get working on those. And of course, a big thank you to Elaine for leading a wonderful webinar and being our expert here to help answer all of these questions and lead us through this final grant report process. And also, don't forget, we will send a follow-up email that has some key tips, the useful resources, and of course, a link to the things we talked about, including the final grant report, so that you have it all in one place to go and work on that.
Wonderful. All the best with the end of this calendar year, everyone. Keep up the great creative work. And Josh is really excited to see those reports start rolling in. Have a great evening, everyone.
Wait.